Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines and take the practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It is December 7th, 2023. Let's dive in. Now, as I'm sure everyone's aware, December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, the Japanese attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, dragging us into World War II and setting the conditions for America to become, a few years later, the most dominant nation in the international system in history. It also set the stage for us to square off with the Soviet Union as our primary geopolitical rival in the post-World War II era. Now, that post-World War II era was defined by a battle of ideology between the US and the Soviet Union, with free market capitalism and representative government democracy on one side, and centrally planned authoritarian communism on the other. We saw this play out all around the world with proxy wars, with trade wars, with the threat of nuclear holocaust hanging over everyone's heads. And then all of a sudden it came to a collapse with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed shortly thereafter by the collapse of the entire Soviet Union, leading to a very interesting moment in time, which Francis Fukuyama has famously labeled the end of history, where it appeared that some form of liberal democratic government, and that's small L liberal, not big L liberal, some form of representative democracy government with some kind of open society participating in some type of capitalist-driven free trade economic structure as part of a global community of nations was now the only legitimate way for a nation state to exist in the modern era. And to the extent that any nation state did not exist in that state, it was going to eventually ride the arc of history to that shining outcome. And this was absolutely a net positive and net good for everybody involved. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've seen a lot of questioning about what America's role in the world should be, what the utility of the current rules-based international order is, and questions about how engaged in the world should America be, and what role or what does the nature of that engagement need to look like? And how do we balance the world's interests versus America's interests? If you want to see one end of the spectrum, it's America first, Donald Trump's favorite slogan. You want to see a different end of the spectrum, it's Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East in that area, and we need to support them no matter what. No questions asked, no other explanation required. And then a whole bunch of messy middle areas. So today, let's look at what are the main arguments people use to support this idea that the current rules-based international order, led by America, morally, economically, and militarily, is still necessary, is still good. And then let's look at what arguments are used to show that supporting freedom and democracy around the world and taking affirmative steps in that direction should be a consistent American foreign policy principle, ranking up there with other realpolitik, hard power considerations. Now, the current rules-based international order, a lot can be said about everything it hasn't done, but there's two interesting stats that we have to look at to evaluate its effectiveness. This global trade, capitalism-driven, post-colonial, post-World War II world economic system that we have, while being very vulnerable and brittle as COVID showed us with supply chain issues, has led to two interesting developments. We currently live in the per capita most peaceful time in human existence, and we also live in the richest time in human existence, as far as most anyone can tell. You wouldn't get that impression looking at the news, but most scholars agree that it's probably true. Now, the guy who really talks about this being the most peaceful time in the world, a guy named Steven Pinker, he wrote a book in 2011 called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And he pointed out an interesting stat that the death rate in the 21st century at that point due to violence is 1 per 100,000 people dying. Out of every 100,000 people dying, only one of them was due to violence. Well, how does that compare with the past? Back up to the Vietnam War, that was 10 per every 100,000. Look at the Korean War era, 1950 to 1953, we have 30 per every 100,000. And in World War II, we're at 300 for every 100,000. Now, you could say those wars were spiking the numbers, but you have to remember in 2011, this is post-surge Iraq. We're still in the middle of Afghanistan. We have issues down in Darfur. There's plenty of hotspots popping up all over the world. And even with all that going on, compare the numbers, it's still incredibly peaceful. And then the other success that's put at the feet of the global international order, especially global trade and how a rising tide raises all ships, is the reduction in absolute poverty. According to UN data, we currently live with the lowest percentage of people in the world in a state of absolute poverty ever. With adjusted for inflation, if you go back to 1820, you have almost 80% of the world's population living under $2 a day. Fast forward to 2018, that's down to 8% living below $2 a day. And that's adjusted for inflation. So the overall wealth of the world has risen dramatically. We can see those same numbers for $30 a day. $30 a day back in 1820, we've got less than 1%. Fast forward to 2018, we're at almost 15%. So as messed up as the world is, with inequality greater than it's ever been, with violence in the news and terrorist attacks always being reported, and all sorts of issues with violence from different sectors, still historically, this is as good as it's ever been. The question then, if you accept that premise, is why? And there's two theories that are often credited for this. One is the democratic peace theory. Now, the democratic peace theory is this theory in international relations that states that countries with liberal democratic forms of government are less likely to go with one another than those with other forms of government. And the main stat pointed to for this is that in the 20th century and in the 21st century, there are no two liberal democracies on record that have gone to war with each other. It just doesn't seem to happen. And there's a couple explanations given for why this might be. One's a structural argument, and that's that the population that would be sent off to fight the war in democracy actually gets to vote for their leaders. And since they get to vote for the leaders, they vote for people that do not send them to war. And so when you have two democratic countries with two populations that do not want to go to war, they look at the leaders and go, hey, go talk to each other, go sort it out. So war becomes a much less attractive option in general because of the domestic consequences that those political regimes would face if they brought their populations to a war. Versus the king just waving a saber saying, hey, grab the peasants, we're going out, is what it is. No questions asked, we're doing this. It didn't go well. Oh, shucks, let me hand out some medals, we'll have some new lords and some new pieces of land, and we're just going to wait 20 years and run this cycle again. The other one is the normative argument, and that's basically democracies don't see each other as threats because they look safe and familiar, and people are just comfortable with folks that look like them. So, Canada and the US look at each other like buddies, going, I understand you, you understand me. It's very easy in open societies to read the intentions of the people that you're dealing with. So there's too many opportunities along the way for de-escalation, and really nothing the other side does is ever seen as that threatening in general. Now, we saw this idea gain bipartisan support in the post-Cold War era, with the Clinton administration using it to justify efforts to replace the autocratic governments in Eastern Europe with democratic ones following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then also George Bush using it to justify attempts to bring democracy to the Middle East. Belief being, if we have democracies there, we'll never have to fight them again, and anything we have to do to get to that point is therefore justified. We can get to the success record on that in a minute, but that was the general idea. Now, there's a lot of questions about the efficacy of this theory. It used to be the hottest thing in international relations. When I was going through my undergrad, I was told this is the closest thing to an empirical law that exists in international relations. It's since been questioned by many folks in many quarters. Now, one of the biggest problems that people point out to it is that there's no real way to show causality. There's no way to show, is it that democracies are inherently more peaceful, or that more peaceful nations become more democratic? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Many have argued that most examples of democratic peace can be explained by different factors. For example, the reason why Canada and Mexico are such good neighbors to the United States has less to do with the fact that we're all democracies and can speak freely, and everything to do with the fact that America could schwack Canada and Mexico militarily 10 times a year for the next decade at the same time without breaking a sweat. And so that really just sets the entire tone of the relationship, and nobody is going to stand up to America basically anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. There's actually a term for that. It's called bandwagoning. Canada and Mexico just bandwagon themselves to the U.S. There's another realist explanation for why nations cooperate with each other, and it's balancing. We see balancing in Europe. Europe is a great example of the democratic peace theory because you have a bunch of democratic countries there who historically have gone to war with each other all the time over anything. See a rise in democracies, see an immediate drop in level of conflict between those states. What you also see there, though, is the creation of the European Union, an economic alliance which is growing their military capability, their expeditionary capability to go and project power abroad. And they do that because that collective group of nations can balance against either the Soviet Union on one side or America. Sorry, not the Soviet Union. They can balance against either Russia on one side or America on the other side. Towards Russia, it's primarily security concerns, even though NATO kind of overlaps in that arena. So the European Union's been slow to create separate institutions to support that. And towards the other side, it's balancing against the economic might of America. So are North America and Europe peaceful because of democratic peace, or are they peaceful because of realpolitik hard power considerations? Difficult to say. Now, criticisms of the democratic peace theory often dovetail into a different theory, which is the theory of capitalist peace. And this is the theory that countries that trade with each other don't fight with each other, because when their trade becomes interdependent, they are less likely to accept the costs that come with losing out on that trade and going to war. So it's not about the vibe, it's not about the votes and the good feelings, it's about the dollar bills. Okay. Bit more cynical, bit closer to a realist interpretation of the world, just putting that economic aspect front and center, not the normative or structural aspects front and center. Fair enough. This theory got so popular post-Cold War, there's actually a corollary to it called the McDonald's peace theory. That's right, folks. There is a McDonald's peace theory, and it is about as empirically valid as the international or the democratic peace theory, which is one of the biggest tongue-in-cheek jokes in international relations. Now, what the McDonald's peace theory points out is that no two countries with a McDonald's ever go to war with each other. Now, this is a claim that came out of the Clinton years with a New York Times columnist, Thomas Friedman, who pointed out this phenomenon. Now, the McDonald's example is a bit of a joke, but what he was getting at was that when countries reach a certain level of economic prosperity, when they have a robust enough middle class at home, they don't go to war because they have other stuff to worry about. They have other interests in mind. The costs are too high for any leader to assume the risk of going to war. And it's really that and the rise of global trade that has led to the reduction in conflict in the post-World War II era. Okay, fair enough. Now, in a true case of just impeccable comedic timing, as soon as Friedman's book hit the shelves, he published the book in 1999, and then the original column he wrote came out in 1996, I believe. As soon as his book hits the shelves, the U.S. led a NATO bombing campaign against Serbia, which had McDonald's in it since 1988. Now, of course, in the updated version of his work following that bombing campaign in Serbia, Friedman very defensively pointed out that, well, NATO is not a country, so this wasn't two countries going to war. That the Kosovo War wasn't really a war because it was like a civil war. That's different. And, you know, in academic circles, you could actually make an argument there. For example, the Correlative War Index, which is this long-running project that looks at conflict around the world and ranks it by battlefield deaths and other factors to create a consistent data set that academics can pull to use when they're looking at this stuff. Technically, the Correlative War Index codes this as a 4, which is a use of force situation, rather than a 5, which is an actual war. If you're thinking to yourself, why does that really matter? It doesn't unless you're working on your PhD thesis. And since then, things haven't exactly gotten better for it. In 2006, the war in Lebanon, McDonald's present. The 2008 Georgia-Russian war, McDonald's present. And then, of course, the 2014 war in Ukraine, and then the subsequent follow-up war a few years later in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, McDonald's. So there's that. Now, why are these two theories important other than just being, you know, fun academic talking points to go through? And we all like talking about, you know, serious things like world trade and national security and global levels of violence and poverty with fun examples like McDonald's, because we all love Mickey D's. The real issue here is that ideas like this get used to justify incredibly large and irreversible foreign policy decisions. Decisions like invading Afghanistan in 2001, decisions like invading Iraq in 2003. Because if we're doing it for democracy and we're doing it for free trade, well, then we know based off the data, even though that's very debatable, that those two things will reduce conflict around the world. Now, if that were true, we would have, if we truly believed that in our bones and the arguments for it were as rock solid as folks like to present them, we would not have pulled out of Afghanistan. Sorry. We would not have pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021. We would have stuck around for the duration because we replaced a nominally, at least looks like a democratic regime, with one that is as authoritarian and brutal and anti-liberal and anti-free trade as possible. And if we believe in the capitalist argument, we would happily give them access to their funds again for economic development. Because as long as we can integrate them into the global economic system, then their tendency to support terrorist groups will be curtailed significantly, leading to long-term security outcomes beneficial to the United States. Or so a consistent argument would go. We can also look at the failure of economic factors to deter Russia in their invasion of Ukraine and continued operations there. Now, we bring these up not because these theories aren't valid. They actually are, and there's a lot of nuance to them. We bring these up because we get back to the question, should America support freedom and democracy around the world, and what does that support look like? As a general principle, yeah, we probably should. The data is clear enough that even though we don't know the correlation versus causation, more democracies are better from a national security standpoint. Why exactly is hard to pin down, but that it is better, that much we know. It's also the best moral argument you can make for how to engage with the world. So from a practical point of view and a moral point of view, yes. From an economic point of view, Yeah, more trade's better from everybody. Less people in poverty. That's a positive thing. But we need to be very careful when we use these ideas to justify interventions abroad. Our recent experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan should be very cautionary tales. Are the brutal war being waged in Ukraine by Russia? Very cautionary tale. There's the old phrase from an old dead Prussian guy that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Politics is an inherently human endeavor, and human beings care about a whole host of issues more than they care about economic systems and how their neighbors vote in other countries. And when those key touch points get triggered, these other considerations don't matter. And we can't put them above other critical national security concerns that other nations have and that we have when assessing how to interact with the world. It's also fun to look at these two theories in parallel because they're often, from the American context, viewed as one and the same, two sides of the same coin. Best example of this is that we thought if we opened up China to the world, as long as they started trading in a free and open way, well, then democracy will follow. Well, that certainly didn't happen. And they're not trading in a free and open way. They're just benefiting from the free and open trade that we provide and the rest of the world provides. And they're continually perpetuating a genocide against their own people, which we're not doing anything about, neither is anyone else. Yikes. So, do democracies, having more of them around, make us safer? Yes, they do. Why do they do that? Not quite sure. But we know that if we have more of them, we're probably better off. Is free trade and capitalism a net positive for everyone involved? So far, the numbers say yes. Does it make us more secure? Probably does. Probably does. Is there a limit to how far it can be taken? Absolutely. Should we be very concerned anytime we see politicians or pundits getting up on the news and justifying their foreign policy endeavors based off of concepts like we support democracy or trade is in everyone's best interest, without also assessing all the other factors at play, factors that we know are ultimately more important, like key national security interests, to other nations and to ourselves? Yes. Now, do the people who stand up there and say those things, do they know it's a limited argument that they're leaving stuff out? Yeah, they do. They're not stupid. And they're also not sitting down and allowing themselves to be fully questioned and fully vetted by anyone to flush out what the actual trade-offs are for their policy, what the limiting principles behind those policies are, other than, well, no limiting principle and just an open-ended commitment to throwing blood and treasure after an ideal. And as citizens of the greatest experiment in democracy and representative government who ever occurred in the world, and as people who pay taxes and vote for the people who control the most powerful military force to have ever existed anywhere in the world, we should be very cautious in what explanations we accept from our leaders about why we do what we do abroad. Because the consequences of not keeping them honest will fall on many people in many places, but it won't fall on them. And that's on us. That's it for today, folks. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.